Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I am Rebecca Winthrop. I am the director of the Center for Universal Education here at the Brookings Institution. I am very, very pleased to welcome you all to this event on education in Africa. Everyone should have their programs. We are calling it Key Challenges and Solutions for Developing Human Capital. And we are co-hosting it and doing it with our colleagues at the World Bank, and very pleased. Thank you, Jaime, for your partnership. Mainly what we want to do is dig into some new and interesting data that the World Bank has produced. I am going to just do a very quick welcome to Sajida Bashir, who has led the research, and I don't know if we have copies, but you will tell everybody how to download it and get it, and there's some out front, of this report, which is called Facing Forward, Schooling for Learning in Africa. And I have looked at it, and it is a wealth of very interesting data. She has been very, very busy, and I'm sure you will find it of interest, lots of new information around education in Africa. And then we're going to hand it over to my colleague, Tamar Manuelian, who is a non-resident senior fellow here with us at Brookings, and formerly at the World Bank, so this is fitting, who will moderate a panel, and she'll introduce our esteemed panelists, and who will react to the new data, and we'll have a conversation with all of you about this really important topic. So welcome everybody, and welcome Sajida.
So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sajida Bashir. I'm the manager for education in East Africa in the World Bank. And I'm just going to take about 20 minutes to explain what the overview of this book contains. The full book is going to come out in about a month or so. But we started this book actually before the WDR, we started working on this because we felt that there was a need to understand what has happened in sub-Saharan Africa over the last 15 to 20 years, both in terms of enrollment and learning, and particularly in view of the Sustainable Development Goals, which prioritizes basic education from grades 1 to 9. We take a framework of from science to service delivery, and briefly what that means is we want to compile evidence about what works, but also how it should be implemented, because that's the important part. It's not enough to know, what is good, what works, but the challenge is how to implement it. And one of the premises of our book is that African countries can also learn from each other. It's not just looking at Finland and Korea and so on, which are all very important, but there's a lot of lessons within Africa, and we try to document in this book through various boxes a lot of good experiences and not so good experiences in Africa, because the fundamental message that we want to convey is that if African education systems have to improve, there has to be a culture of continuous improvement, of learning by doing, and of incremental learning, which has been the hallmark of high-performing systems. So briefly in this report, in this book, we compare countries by education progress and learning. We focus on 4 areas: student progression, teachers, budgets, and capacity gaps, and we draw out some of the implications for the region, also looking ahead. The title of the book, Facing Forward, comes from a quotation from Kwame Nkrumah, who was asked at one stage, do you look east or west? At that time, that was the issue. And he said, we look neither east nor west, we face forward. And that is part of our philosophy, that no matter how challenging the situation, you do have to face forward. You do have to face the challenges that Africa faces. So just to briefly set the context, the first chapter of our book covers a lot about the context of Africa, because there's some things the education sector cannot solve. And here I show you the growth in per capita income in Africa, the average per capita income. And the big story in Africa is for about 30 years, per capita income declined and then slowly increased. It was only around 2007 that you reached the per capita income levels of about 1974. That has not happened in any other region. And Jomtien, you see, is about 1990. You see that the enrollments, which are the the bars, they were sort of stagnating around the 80s, right? And then started picking up from about the early 90s. So Africa has had a very challenging context. And it's with that backdrop that we should try and assess the progress that has been made. We also contextualize other challenges that we actually document them, but I show just this one picture to show how dramatic the impact of the economic crisis, the sustained economic crisis, was in Africa. So one of the big messages of our book is that we cannot speak of sub-Saharan Africa as one anymore. We see 4 distinct groups emerging based on the educational progress in primary education coverage, just taking coverage alone. The first group is what we are calling established group. They're the gross enrollment ratios of about 100, 110, about right, and a lower secondary gross enrollment ratio, which is grades 7 to 9, of about 90%. So these countries have more or less achieved universal primary and even basic education, lower secondary education, mostly in southern Africa, some in eastern, Ghana, and a few of the island nations, Mauritius, etc. The second group is, and second and third groups we're calling emerged and emerging, relatively high gross enrollment ratios, relatively lower secondary gross enrollment ratios, and a high number of out-of-school children, which I'll show later. That covers a large number of countries and a surprising number of countries that should have done better. And finally, you have a group which we are calling delayed. Look at the geographical distribution, all under the Sahel belt, the Francophone countries mostly, not even covering universal primary education, let alone lower secondary education. So unpacking that a little bit, if you see the 4 groups now with the country names, you see that the gross enrollment ratio of the first group is pretty high, but around 100, which is what it should be. Of the other 2 groups, higher than 100 because they have a lot of overage children. And the last group, which is largely under 100%. But we also add here the rate of out-of-school children, and you see the big difference between the Group 1 countries, relatively low. They've succeeded in getting all the kids in. The Group 4 countries with 40-50% of the kids still out of school. So our one message is sub-Saharan Africa is diverging. Let's not talk about it as one continent, one region, one monolithic region. That's not the case. In fact, we have a huge problem with the Group 4 countries, but the Group 1 countries could possibly go on to the next level. So that's one of our main messages. And if you look at the progress towards lower secondary education, you see the same trend. Group 1 countries in 2000 already relatively high, though some of them were low before. All countries have increased, but you see in Group 4, it's still around 40%. So again, a huge divergence in performance. The Group 1 countries more or less universalizing basic education in terms of coverage. In our book, we also compare how these countries compare in terms of contextual challenges. And we see, I'm not showing it here, but I think we have it in the overview table, we see clearly that the countries that were in Group 4, they also had many challenges in terms of high population rate, conflict, high linguistic diversity. We list 7 challenges, and we have a index of that, and we have categorized the groups according to the challenges, and you see a correlation between those that are in the group 4 and those that have many challenges. So context does matter. It does influence what happens, and those things are sometimes outside the control of the education sector. But at the end, I will mention whether those contextual challenges have changed substantially, and we will see that they haven't really changed for that group of countries. So again, group 4 countries is a very big issue, I think, for all those who are concerned about whether children are getting into school. Now, this is not only about schooling and getting kids into school, it's also about learning, and we have looked at data from about 96 assessments or tests that have been administered, international or regional. We've left aside the national assessments, but because we could not really correlate them, benchmark them with international assessments. And a large number of countries have participated in some form of assessments. And so these are the assessments that we have looked at. Now, the next slide tries to put together how we could compare these assessments. Remember, some of them are for grade 8, some are for grade 2, some are for Francophone, et cetera, et cetera. There are different kinds of tests, SACMEC, PACSEC, TIMS, et cetera. So in order to find a way of comparing them, we said, well, what percentage of kids achieve at least the minimum proficiency as defined by that test? Okay, what percentage achieve that minimum proficiency? The minimum proficiency may differ across tests, but can we see whether, most kids achieve the minimum proficiency, which means at least they're learning at that grade level. So the next slide, this slide shows each dot represents an assessment, and we are trying to show what percentage of kids achieve the minimum proficiency. So the green dots show that about 75% of kids achieve the minimum proficiency, and the red dots show that less than 25% achieve the minimum proficiency. And you see most fall between 25 to 50, but the green dots are more in the group 1 countries, apart from Burundi, and we have an explanation why we think Burundi might be doing better. But you see that most of the group 3 and group 4 countries are really, I mean, you have to say that most kids are not learning, because only 25%, maximum 25%, are reaching the minimum proficiency. So there is a learning crisis in Africa, but it is differentiated. Here we present the results of the service delivery indicators, and I just want to focus on the yellow bars, which shows whether kids are able to read a paragraph by the end of 4th grade. And the proportions are like 20% or below, except for Tanzanian kids who are taught or tested in Kiswahili, where there's a better level of comprehension. So we look at the correlates of learning, and we see that systematically some groups of children do worse. Poor children, rural children, children who do not speak the language of instruction, and the gender effect, that varies by country. The big story in Africa is the high level of inequality between schools. It's astonishing the proportion of variance that is due to between school variation in learning in test scores is much higher in Africa than in other regions where we have comparable data. And essentially we see that if a school has higher SES, average SES, then they do better, they get better resources, and so on. So there is a big inequality problem within countries. But teachers, classrooms, and school resources do make a difference, especially structured pedagogy, teacher content knowledge, instructional time, and infrastructure, as well as classroom and school pedagogical resources. We highlight in our book one of the things we feel has not been highlighted enough, that the language of instruction policy is a major issue in Africa. The languages used at home and at school, if it's not the same, if the child is not familiar, has not heard anything, even if the parents are illiterate, there's wide gaps in learning in grade 2. We see that carrying on in grade 6 for the PASIC data. We see it in SACMEC data. We see it in the service delivery indicators data. It's unambiguous as far as we can tell. That doesn't mean it's easy to solve it, but it's something we have to take note of. This slide puts together evidence from the impact evaluations that have been done in Africa, not many, 59, of which a huge number is in Kenya. Guess why? But anyway, they are done. They are increasingly being done, and you see the effects that are there for different kinds of interventions. We also compare evidence that is there for attendance, for improving attendance, but primarily we have looked at the learning interventions. So the 4 areas of focus in the study, and I will have to really be very short on this and encourage you to read the book when it comes out in a month's time. We have the overview right now. We say in the first fundamental thing is you've got to get students through from grade 1 to grade 9. That may sound like a very simple thing to do, but it's not happening. In the early grades, there is a complete traffic jam. The children are there, they're churning in the same class, repeating, etc. That's one problem. The second is that we need to deal with the transition from grade 6 or whatever is primary to lower secondary. You need to address the supply side, and you need to address the demand side. So the early grade traffic jam, we characterize it as resulting from 3 factors. First is children are just not attending regularly in grade 1, grade 2. They come in, they kind of attend, and then they leave, and so on. And they repeat years, they learn very little. What happens is the class sizes are enormous. You go to most great African countries, class 1 will be 80 to 150 kids. There's no way any learning can take place in those conditions. They're different ages. Classes tend to be held outside. If there are few classrooms, these kids are put outside. There are few learning materials. Teachers don't know how to teach reading and learning, reading and numeracy, even with small groups, but let alone in large groups. And then children don't understand the language of instructions, and sometimes teachers are not familiar with the language. I'm not showing it here, but we have a graph in the book where we show how certain countries are more affected by this early grade traffic jam. Believe it or not, it's the countries in group 3 and group 2. Those are the ones that really went ahead with universalizing primary education, but didn't get this flow through this system. So group 4 countries don't have that problem because most of the kids are still outside school. It's going to come to them. So we need to tackle this problem. We highlight the fact that Latin America had a problem like this 15, 20 years ago, and they had to tackle it. It's not just a problem of formal repetition. There's informal repetition. In many cases, that leads to about 30, 40% of the kids repeating. So there's small wonder that by the time you get to grade 4, hardly any kid can read a paragraph. There's no condition for doing that. The second big issue and progression is the survival through grade 9. And you see the big problem occurs around grade 6 generally. And in some cases, like Malawi, just 16% of kids reach grade 9 of the kids that have started in grade 1. Malawi introduced free primary education in 1994. And it has not handled this problem at all. It has one of the biggest early grade traffic jam problems also. So there's a big problem of transition, and we are saying that this is something we better plan for now because lower secondary enrollment is going to double in 10 years. We need a way of having a strategy for lower secondary schools. Perhaps we need to use ICT. We need to take a decision on whether it's boarding schools or not. We have to eliminate exams between lower primary and primary and lower secondary, and special strategies for girls and the nomadic children and so on. Teachers is a big issue in the report. In fact, it's one of the largest chapters, and we identify 5 areas: improving knowledge and practice, strengthening school leadership, deploying correctly, and so on. We identify that there are leakages in the teacher management system at multiple points. How teachers are recruited, how they're deployed, whether they're present in school and in the classroom, and whether teaching learning occurs in the classroom. And there's a lot of data on all of this. In fact, one of the surprising things is that the teaching profession still attracts among the better educated people in Africa. It's not true to say that they may be not the engineers and doctors, but they're better than the others. But their pre-service education is not very good. The deployment is terrible, and just the simple systems that you would expect to function are not functioning. I'm not showing the disparities between the groups. In the book, we do show that, and we show that the Group 1 countries generally do better. Now, one of the problems in Africa has been that, well, not a problem, maybe it's a good thing, they recruited a lot of teachers. The increase in teacher numbers is the most phenomenal across all regions. But as a result, you had a lowering of standards. All kinds of people became teachers, some with grade 8, some with grade 6. In Malawi, we document, or was it Mozambique? I think we documented 18 different teacher training systems over the last 15 years. Because every donor that came in with a different system. Some said distance, some said one year, some said let's do it on the job. And so you have this stock of teachers who are at very different levels. So this data from the service delivery indicators shows about teacher knowledge. If you look at like the hardest task in language, composition task, or comparing fractions, look at the numbers of teachers of grade 4 who can do that. Okay, they are the best, so-called, in the system at that level, and yet they're not able to do this. So when we're providing teacher training for teachers with this level of content knowledge, we really need to differentiate between teachers who may know something and teachers who may know barely more than what the students know. And we're not doing enough of that. So this is another big lesson that we have to take into account. What is the existing teacher stock? Because we're not going to be able to upgrade learning using standard methods of teacher training. And this is probably something that's known to a lot of you as a result of the service delivery indicators, but it was a bit of a surprise that actually a lot of the teachers may be present in school, but not in class. So there's a breakdown in accountability at the school level. Okay. But we don't think this is the only problem to be fixed, because even if these teachers are in class, but they don't know how to teach or what they're teaching, maybe there won't be that much gain in learning also. On the budget, we identify 4 areas, and I know I'm running over, but Tamar, give me 2 minutes. We think that spending incremental resources on learning, reducing the disparities in the standards of provision, improving the efficiency of public spending, and actually projecting what the requirements are. These are important areas. We do need more resources. We are not of the group that says resources are not required. They are required in Africa. Average spending is $200 per student in primary. Within Africa, there's a huge disparity. Mauritius and South Africa spend $2,000. So some countries are spending less than $200. Okay, and enrollments are going to be doubling in lower secondary. Our main message is this needs to come from domestic revenues, largely. Don't think aid will solve the problem. It's actually stagnant, and it's not very much, frankly speaking. So, but what you spend on is important. Currently, most of it is on teachers' salaries, barely anything on the rest of the service. A lot of that comes from donors. So we're saying shift, you know, improve the composition of the spending. If you want an education of quality, you cannot just be providing a poorly trained teacher with low content knowledge and call that education. You need the books, you need the assessments, you need other things, and all that should be part of the education service. We are also strongly advocating for a minimum package to improve equity across schools. And improving budget planning, spending, and execution. We document through, I don't know how many PERs we reviewed, public expenditure review after public expenditure review in the bank is saying that there is low capacity to implement in ministries of education, even if you were to increase on non-salary. Even salary controls are weak. And we document graphs from the public expenditure financial accountability surveys to show how poorly countries are doing on this. So this is an enormous problem. We don't think the donors are doing very well either. These are the PIFA ratings of donor practices. A means they've done really well. That is, there is actually predictable direct budget support by country grouping. Just 2 countries got an A rating, donors in 2 countries. Most of the donors get a rating of D or D+. This is not just for education. This is for all aid, but we can assume it's the same for education. So donors are not doing that well either. And I don't have a graph here, but we also document that the level of aid per child is only about $9 or $8 per child. And surprisingly, a lot of it is in the Group 1 countries, not in the Group 4 countries. So where are the donors? 4 countries got most of the aid, Ethiopia, Tanzania, and a couple of others, got about 60% of the aid. Finally, we address the issue of capacity gaps in the ministries of education, because this, we think, is the fundamental link that is breaking down. Knowledge of what to do, that's not enough. Increased financial resources is not enough. The big problem is the implementation capacity. What you need to get to is these, if each of these little things with flags represented about 5,000 schools, you have to get to all these schools. 20,000 in Ethiopia, 4,000 in Burundi, whatever. You need to get to all those schools. You need planning capacity, data capacity. We note that many of the countries don't have that. But the bigger problem is their technical institutions don't have technical capacity, but they also, the ministries of education, don't have the capacity for coordination of all these units, of negotiation, of developing accountability mechanisms, of developing incentives. And so everything I have mentioned up to now, okay, even if they knew what to do, they couldn't get it down to the school level. Because if you want to say that you need to address the early grade traffic jam, every single school, every single teacher needs to know what has to be done. And that isn't happening yet in most of the countries. We do document some cases where countries have taken good action on this. We finally say that there is a market failure in capacity building, and we have built on the work that Birger has done, Birger Fredriksson, and he say that the problem is that in the demand side, the longer-term capacity needs are actually not expressed, because ministries of finance, they don't want to pay for it, they don't want to borrow for it, there's short electoral cycles, and the long-term capacity building required is the kind of thing that takes longer time, and also need to learn by doing. The supply, on the other hand, tends to be fragmented, short duration, project-based, including the World Bank. It's related to planning. A lot of the effort is on let's get the plans right, rather than on implementation, and focused on implementation of the project. Let's train a few staff, get a few equipment, or international technical assistance that isn't sustained at all. So there is a big problem of getting demand and this getting the demand expressed and the supply to be of the right kind. Finally, looking ahead or facing forward, there are some key challenges. The economic growth across the continent is highly heterogeneous. Some countries have become more diversified. There are large cohorts of school-aged children. The TFRs in many countries are 4 or above, okay? And these two constraints, unfortunately, affect those Group 4 countries and Group 3 countries much more. So they're in a bad position now. They have dim prospects going forward. And the need to expand education with quality, you'll have a 50% increase in primary enrollment and 100% increase in lower secondary enrollment. These are sobering trends, but we conclude by saying that Africa has come a long way, and there is every possibility that it can meet this challenge as long as we build the capacities and we focus on a few things that we should get right. Thank you very much.
You're at the end there. Yeah, go ahead. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Great. My name is Tamar Manuelian, and I will be moderating this panel. Thank you, Sajita. That was excellent. I am so delighted that you have put together this report, the first really regional look at the education challenges in Africa. And you've done a terrific job of compiling the disparate available evidence into a coherent storyline. So what we're going to try and do in this panel is to dig a little bit deeper into some of the issues. I don't think we're going to be able to do justice to the complexity and the number of issues that the continent is facing, but we'll give it a try. So what we're going to do is we'll have a moderated discussion. I'll ask the panelists a couple of questions, and then I hope to leave some time for engaging with you all, the audience. Let me introduce the panel first. I'm going to start with Amel Karbul. Amel is the CEO of the Education Outcomes Fund for Africa, and she's commissioner for the Education Commission. She's a social entrepreneur, chairwoman, author, and politician. And Amel has held leadership and senior consultancy positions in several large corporations. She was also visiting professor at Duke, member of the Global Diplomacy Lab, and advisory board member for a number of organizations, including the Global Business Coalition for Education. And until February 2015, she was Minister of Tourism in the Tunisian government, the transition government, and she was nominated as one of the 10 leading young African politicians. She recently published her newest book called Coffin Corner, intriguing title, outlining a new leadership culture suited to the complexity and dynamics of the 21st century. She has a master's in mechanical engineering and a doctorate in coaching and mentoring. I thought that signified a very interesting transition, and I hope we get to hear what's behind that.
15 years in between.
Our second panelist is Her Excellency Sarah Anyang Agbor. She's the African Union Commissioner for Human Resources, Science and Technology, was elected in July 2017, and that encompasses education, youth and capacity development, and science and technology. Prior to her election, Professor Angor held a number of high-level positions in the Ministry of Higher Education in her native country, Cameroon. And she was also Deputy Vice Chancellor in charge of research cooperation and relations with the business world at the University of Bamenda in Cameroon. In passing, I'll say Bamenda is one of my favorite countries in Cameroon, and I have visited. Professor Agbor is professor of African and Commonwealth literatures, and she has authored 3 textbooks and many other publications. And last, my neighbor, Jaime Saavedra Chanduvi. Jaime leads the Education Global Practice at the World Bank. He rejoined the World Bank Group from the government of Peru, where he served as Minister of Education from 2013 through 2016. And I'll ask him some questions about that stint. And his first round at the World Bank, which encompassed 10 years of service, most recently as Director for Poverty Reduction and Equity. And throughout his career, Jaime, who's a Peruvian national, has led some innovative work in the areas of poverty and inequality, employment and labor markets, the economics of education, and monitoring and evaluation systems. He has worked at a number of international organizations and think tanks, and also held teaching positions in academia. He too has published widely, and he holds a PhD in economics from Columbia University. Okay, let's get started. I'm going to start with Jaime. Jaime, one of the key messages from the report, and we heard it from Sajita, is the importance of data. And she talked about the importance of data for managing at different levels of the education system, and particularly at the school level. But I want to focus on one set of data, which are the learning assessments. We saw quite, I think, heartening that there's a lot more than there was a decade ago, but it's still incredibly patchy. The data are from different assessments that don't necessarily talk to each other, so they had to go through a lot of gymnastics to actually put together a coherent picture. And my question is, why not think about supporting getting the African countries together to have a regional assessment at different levels of either age or grade that allows countries to track systematically how students are learning and be able to compare themselves to each other, as well as ideally to the international assessments, which many of them don't participate in because the outcome levels are so low that it really doesn't make any sense for them to participate in the PISAs and TIMS. What do you think of this idea? Does it make sense to have a regional assessment?
So look, first of all, the first part of the answer is more related to does it make sense to do learning assessments? And then, okay, let's go to the details of the technology. And the answer for me is a resounding yes.
Which is why I didn't ask you that question.
But I think it is important for countries to understand the importance first of having a national capacity to do even the basics, which is learning assessments about reading, writing, and math, right? Where there are so many things that enter into the education process that are related to social-emotional skills, for instance. I mean, basic things that we want kids to learn and acquire in school that we're not, I mean, we're not there in terms of that technology. So let's focus on, let's be very parochial, and let's focus on just right, reading, writing, and math, which is what we can more or less assess a little bit better than other things. But even in there, as you said, the deficit is huge. When we say that in the developing world, about 50% of the kids do not have the basic proficiency in primary education, in math and in reading, actually that's an overstatement, because that 50% is of those countries for which we have data. Right? And of the developing world, about 2/3 of countries, we have some data. You know, some good data, another third okay data, but there's a third in which we don't have no data at all. Right? Most likely, those countries are even performing even worse. Right? So actually, that 50%, right, globally, it's an understatement. So we have a huge challenge. And the key point for me is not if it's a regional or international, if it's regional or sub-regional as we have in Africa. We do have two sub-regional families of assessments, which, I mean, we will continue that, that would be great, because the key point is to develop the national capacity to do any type of learning assessment, right? Ideally, it's a national assessment, and you participate in some sort of international assessment as well. And why the two things are critical? Because the national assessment, that has to be done ideally on a census-based, so for all schools, because those assessments more at the micro level, at the school level, will generate a change in behavior. It's not only that will allow us to know where the country is, or where the different provinces or districts of the countries are, but also it will give us information that can go back to the schools and allow the schools to act upon that, right? So that's the beauty of having strong national assessments that could be done on a census-based. Usually, those who are internationally comparable will be a sample, right, in the country. And that's another important use, because it will allow us to see, okay, so how is this country doing compared to others? Usually will allow us to see how urban versus rural, or a few large geographic subdivisions, and that's useful. But that's not information that will go back to the school, right? That's allow us to give us the macro picture. That macro picture is important, of course it's important. And just I close with the anecdote that the World Bank colleagues who are here have heard me, but those international assessments also generates changes in behavior more at the national level, right? Like it or not, some people do not like rankings. People might not agree if PISA is a fantastic measurement tool, but it has a use and it generates impact in the countries, right? In my case, just 2 weeks after or 3 weeks after I started my tenure as Minister of Education, the PISA results came out of 2012. In 2013, 1 year later, the PISA results came out, and Peru was last in the ranking, right? Not bottom 10% and next to last, not last, right? So for the press, Peru was last of the world, right? The footnotes that no, the PISA test is 65 countries, mostly industrialized countries, plus some other countries. Nobody cared about the footnotes, right? That explained the 65 countries. For the press, we were last in the world, period. That was it, right? Hence, that, in a way, that was useful to say, look, we're not in trouble. We're in deep trouble, right? So this is a country that has been growing, but has not been investing enough in education. So that matters a lot.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to push on this point a little bit more because I think it's really important, and I agree with the complementarity of use between national data and international data. I'm going to posit that it's going to be many years before African countries will be able to participate in the international assessments like TIMSS and PISA and actually get meaningful results that per action. They're all going to be in the bottom 10%, and it's just disheartening, and countries will drop out.
Yeah, we can go to that.
So that's why I'm pushing for the idea of a regional assessment that can allow, that could be done in such a way that it links up with the international assessments, but at least provides a little bit more meaningful information to the countries that are comparing themselves to their peers. And Professor Agbor, part of this, I think, is an issue of getting countries to cooperate with each other. So I'm going to ask you whether you think this idea makes sense and whether there's a role for the African Union here to bring countries together and say, let's do this.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody here.
The African Union has a mission. And what is this mission? The mission of an integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa, driven by its own competent and skilled citizens to be able to play in the global arena. That is the vision of Agenda 2063. For the Africa we want, for the Africa we envisage. Yes, the African Union has a big responsibility because the African Union is made up of 55 member states that make up the African Union. And for us to be able to move for the Africa we want, there is need for us to develop competencies and skills, which competencies and skills can only be developed when we have quality education. Because it is only through the quality education that we can empower our youth to be able to represent us in the global arena. Presently, over 65% of the African population is made up of youth, and many of them have degrees, for those who have gone to school. Many of them have degrees, but they do not have job. So they become job seekers with their so-called qualified degree certificates in their pockets. Why is it like that? It is because we've not been able to tailor our educational output to the functional needs of our society. And for that reason, the African Union Agenda 2063 is a 50-year process divided into 5 phases of 10 years each. The first year addresses this problem, where the role of the African Union comes in, is the education strategies that has been put in place. We have what we call CESA 2016 to 2025. And what is CESA? That is CESA, the Continental Education Strategy for Africa, which stresses the importance of data in one of its 12 strategic objectives, namely Objective 11, that states, improve management of education system, as well build and enhance capacity for data collection, management, analysis, communication, and use. And when she was presenting, she did a very detailed such that it was even heartbreaking for me to sit there and listen to what she was saying about the stage at which we are in the African in Africa. So in this objective 11, we aim to build and enhance capacity for data collection, management, analysis, communication, and improve the management of education system as well as the statistical tool through capacity building for data collection, management analysis, communication, and utilization. Our main objective is to establish regional, which is what you were talking about, the regional analysis, is to establish regional and continental education management information systems and education observatories. Why do we need to do that? The African continent has 5 regions: East Africa, West Africa, Southern Africa, Central Africa, and North Africa. It is very essential, and there are dynamics in all these member states and all these regions that will not suit. So we cannot say that one solution suits all. No. It needs to be functional to that particular member state or that particular rural area that we are talking about. And this is because we are making concerted efforts to develop appropriate common indicators in the continent for monitoring the level of each country's performance. And then comprehensive databases comparable across countries are necessary that are integrated in continental and regional works. And more common standardized and harmonized instruments are being developed and shared among countries and regional economic communities that will be used for data collection to ensure that all member states are able to effectively report on all assets of statistics and indicators, and to ensure cross-country comparison, a minimum set of norms and standards intended to guide countries in developing or improving national education management information systems is essential. And that is why we have the Specialized Technical Committee on Education, Science, and innovation, and technology. And these specialized technical committees does not only work on that, but we also have what we call the Champions of 10 for Education, Science, and Technology. And these Champions of 10 is made up of 10 head of states who are supposed to champion education, science, and technology for the continent. And this Champions of 10 is coordinated by the President of Senegal, President Macky Sall. And we know that Senegal has made good strides when it comes to their education guidelines. So based on common agreed system and collected data, we have a continental education management information system will be built, and all data will be uploaded into the continental education management information system data portal. Ministries of Education and Training and national statistical offices are being encouraged to provide information and support the continental EMIS data portal. This is where we have the problem. They get the information, but they don't send it. And when they don't send it, we don't have complete information. Like you rightly said, we can have from others, but there are so many others that we don't have information about, and that affects the statistics. So we need to be on the same page. And that is why it will be necessary to build capacity at both institutional and individual expert levels to ensure development and maintenance of this education management information system. So an African observatory, an African education observatory has been established as part of the means to serve as a vehicle for coordinating EMI's activities. And this observatory is managed by the African Union Commission, and recruitment of staff is underway. And what are the other responsibilities of this observatory? One, to develop and maintain an internet portal.
Okay,
We have a
I'm gonna
big
ask
problem
you
on that.
okay. You clearly have a lot to say, and it sounds incredibly detailed. The strategy.
But you send the questions.
And planning sounds wonderful, and I do hope that the implementation will also be successful. And I encourage you to also coordinate and cooperate with other agencies that are working in the Africa region. You bring the credibility and the legitimacy of the African Union on the political side, but taking advantage of the technical expertise of other institutions would also be most welcome.
We have Nepal on board.
Thank you. Let me move on to Amel, if I may. I'm going to ask you a question about resources. We worry quite a bit about putting existing funding to good use, and Sajita mentioned that. But she also made it very clear, and I fully agree, that Africa will need to mobilize more resources, especially because the countries are still many years away from the demographic transition. There's more and more kids that are going to be entering the school system, and more funding is going to be required. So clearly more funding is needed domestically because international funding is limited. But there is a need from external funders, especially for some countries. Again, we heard donors gravitate toward a handful of countries that happen to be the well-performing ones, and there are 8 orphan countries that remain also in the education sector. So can you tell us about the initiative that you've been championing as a commissioner on the Outcomes Fund, and how this fund would help both with the funding and the delivery challenges?
Okay, sure. Yeah, thank you. So maybe just to kind of position this in the family of education financing. You know, at the work in the Education Commission, we said, yes, domestic financing has to be the backbone of education spending. Then we have ODAs and international aid. And then the question, there are a few gaps. So GPE, which supports governments, so we've all, seen, supported the replenishment and happy about, the successful replenishment. There was another gap, which is for low middle income countries, which means like low income countries get very concessional loans. When you become middle income, sometimes the interest on your loan is too high to be able to borrow for education, but actually your systems, like your economy has not improved so much. So IFID, which is the International Facility for Education, which is also championed by the Education Commission, is another to fill that gap so that countries are not stuck. They're not poor enough to get, very cheap loans. They're not rich enough to be able to pay good interest. And so IFID should kind of subsidize and help low middle income rich get loans. So that's, and it's been designed in the last years, and now we hope that it's going to start soon. And then, so I just want to position us within the family, of education financing, because I think it's important. But there is another gap, which is funding. So GP funds, governments, and IFID will also be mostly repayable finance for government. The question is, non-state actors have a role to play in education. And when we say non-state actors, we don't mean for-profit private education. Non-state actors can be non-profit and faith and community-based and many other actors. So the education outcome funds try actually to tackle many challenges, and I'm going to say very quickly how. So one is the focus on outcomes. So the outcome payment fund is pulling funds from donors, from aid, from philanthropy, and from CSR. We aim to reach a $1 billion outcome payment fund, which will pay only for outcomes. So it's not going to pay for schools and teacher salaries and building things. It will pay for children in grade 4 that can read a paragraph. Yeah. So the idea is which pay for success or pay for results. Now, that's one thing, because we all seen that too many children are in school but not learning. So the idea is, how can we focus more on outcomes? Now, on the other side, service providers. There are service providers, especially in areas like early childhood, technical training, maybe ancillary services around core deliveries, such as remedial education, or getting children back to school, etc. Tech, and etc. So there are non-state actors that can then bid for those outcomes. So we will define the outcomes with the countries where we are active. The technical terms enter here. Emily is the guru for impact bonds, so hope I'm doing this right. But the rate card, which will be defined, what outcomes, what target population, and how much are we willing to pay per outcomes. Service provider bid for this and can deliver it. So now, because in education, you need a long term to deliver outcomes. So we're talking about 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 7 years. Service providers normally cannot wait 7 years to be paid. So what happened here, this is kind of the magic of the mechanism, is you have impact investors that come in, that give project financing, but even more than just the working capital, they would give the performance management to the service provider to be able to deliver to the beneficiaries. Once the outcomes are achieved and a third-party evaluator's neutral one says they are achieved, the outcome payer, so our fund, pays basically the investors their money back plus a certain return depending on the outcomes achieved. Now, where is the magic here? The magic here is different. So as an outcome payment, you only pay for outcomes, which is a huge, could be like a game changer in aid and philanthropy in many areas. On the service provider side, I don't know if any of you are on a service provider or non-state actor in education. So far, if you receive grants, they're so bureaucratic. If you feel like you should do something different to reach outcomes, they tell you, oh yeah, you can change only 10% within each budget line, and you can do it only once and not twice, and it's really a headache. And you do a lot of reporting, very little overhead, so your capacity to scale is very limited. You cannot invest in your infrastructure and institution. So this really changes the game, because basically it's unrestricted funding what you get. With the impact investor, put the money. They will manage you differently than a grant giver, because they're incentivized around reaching outcomes. So they will help you with your data, with your performance management, etc. But you'll unleash much more innovation and entrepreneurship in delivering the outcomes. So this is called impact bonds, which is unfortunate because they are not bonds. I like the French word, which is contrat impact social, which means contract. Which is a contract between the outcome funder, the service provider, and the impact investor. And for the impact investor, this is very attractive because the trend with the millennials, wanting not only to invest for return, but for impact. There are big pension funds in the world today that have like 5% or so of their capital have to invest in impact investing, etc. And the piece is, if this mechanism actually transforms a social and developmental challenge into an investable opportunity, which is huge. Because if you can give uncorrelated returns to investors, let's say, I don't know, even if I say like 5% or so, and if you attract 5% of all the money that is managed in the world, I think it's around $4 trillion. That's a lot of money. Yeah. So the question is, how can we tap in more into capital market and new funding through this? So this is not completely new. There are 108 impact bonds all over the world. Most of them called social impact bonds when the outcome payer is government. They're called development impact bonds when the outcome payer is an aid agency or philanthropy. The thing about them, they've been quite expensive to set up. The transaction costs have been very high to agree, but because each of them has been almost developed from scratch. So what we're trying to do now with this outcome payment fund is to scale this, to say, yes, we've learned a lot, it's been expensive, but we see this as R&D money, research and development. Now it's time to scale, and so to kind of make those transactions much more efficient and much more cheaper. So the idea is really to harness the capacity of non-state actors to support public education and to bring kind of fresh and new capital.
Great, thank you. I think this is quite exciting, and you did a very nice job of explaining it, because I see also potentially spillover effects for the rest of the system.
Oh yeah, and just very quickly, like the one development impact bond is Educate Girl in Rajasthan. The interesting thing is like 80% of the payment is around learning and 20% is around access. And we just met them in London Monday, actually. And what they said is actually the impact bonds is only 1% of their funding. But that 1% now, that project has changed totally the way they work, completely. Like being much, much more outcome focused, much, much more data proficient, etc. So we hope this is going to work. And if it works, it's really going to be a game changer.
We'll do another set of questions a little bit more quickly, perhaps, so we can open up to the floor. So, Professor Agbor, I want to ask you a difficult question, and I'm just putting it up front that it is difficult, and it's about the challenge that Sajita also mentioned about the large number of kids that are going to enter secondary education in the Africa region. As she said, student enrollment is expected to double between 2015 and 2030. So how should African governments approach this challenge of obviously accommodating the growing number of children that are coming in, but also ensuring the quality and relevance of lower secondary education? So I guess my question is, how do we avoid the trouble we got into with primary education?
Thank you. We have this specialized technical committee on education, science and technology. And it is this specialized technical committee that looks into the problem or the challenges of education in Africa. And from the African Union perspectives, African governments, among other efforts, they need to domesticate at national level what we call the continental education strategy for Africa, because there is a template from each level, from the primary to the secondary to the tertiary. So there are different templates that have been written down, that have become rules and regulations that should be made implementable in their various member states. And then we specifically have, under that continental education strategy, we have objectives, Objective 1, Objective 2, and Objective 3. The first is to revitalize the teaching profession to ensure quality and relevance at all levels. Like she mentioned, when you go to some schools, they don't have the right kind of training, and so they don't function on the same level. So there is need for the member states to domesticate this scissor in their, to fit the challenges of their own particular societies. Secondly, there is need to build, rehabilitate, preserve education infrastructure, and then develop policies that ensure a permanent, healthy, and conducive learning environment in all subsectors and for all, so as to expand access to quality education. And for this reason, particularly for the primary school, we came up with this African school feeding, homegrown school feeding. Because when kids go to school without having the right kind of meal, they cannot concentrate in class. So what do? The African Union came with this homegrown school feeding, where schools are encouraged to have farms where they can build, where they can plant what the students can eat. And from my experience in Zimbabwe, March 1st, there is a school in the suburb that is able to grow enough food to be able to have a revenue of $100,000 every year consecutively for the past 2 years. And that is through homegrown school feeding. The third thing is that they need to harness the capacity of ICT to improve access, quality, and management of education and training systems. Because there are some parts of Africa where you don't have internet access, and there are many who cannot go to school or cross over to the city to go to school. But if we have the right kind of ICT, they will be able to access this education through internet education, etc. And so the capacity of the teacher training system in Africa is also very, very essential. And all this is embodied in what we call the Continental Education Strategy for Africa, 2016 to 2025.
Thank you. Jaime, you started to talk about your time as education minister in Peru, and you mentioned how Peru was last in the PISA in which it had just participated in. I know I don't have firsthand knowledge, but talking to my colleagues who were interacting with you at the time, you clearly had a very productive stint as education minister in Peru, and Peru made tremendous strides during that period. So congratulations on that. You can tell us where Peru ended up if you want at the end of your tenure, but I wanted to ask you a little bit about the politics of education reform. I know you made progress, but I know it wasn't easy. I also know that politics is local, so every country will have its own challenges and therefore its own particular constellation of actors to think about. But are there a few lessons that you can share with us that you think would translate across countries from your experience in Peru?
So there are many issues regarding politics that are unavoidable, right? But let me mention two things: one at the more micro level, and the other at the policy macro level. So, on the micro level, let me go to Brazil actually, and not to Peru. And I was a couple of months ago in a district called Sobral, which is in Ceará, in the northeast of Brazil. Brazil is a very decentralized system. And so there's most of the roles in basic education, most of the roles at the state level, and a lot of the roles are at the municipality level. Well, Sobral is a municipality that 15 years ago was in the position 1,300 of the municipalities in Brazil, right? There are more than 2,500 municipalities in Brazil, but they have a very good measurement learning measurement system, so they have data by municipality. 15 years later, Sobral is number one. Despite being a municipality, this is still a poor municipality in a poor northeastern state in Brazil. So what happened is that regarding the reforms, actually the most important reforms that they did were related to teachers and principals. So basically the key point was that principals were going to be selected more in a meritocratic basis, right? So usually principals had been selected because of the party, because of whoever you were a relative of the mayor or whatever. So it was about politics, right? In terms of who were running the schools and also how teachers were deployed in the municipality. So the two big changes were, one, select principals in a meritocratic basis, and then teachers' deployment and teachers' then promotions were not related to politics, but were related to the system, to the learning systems that they had, and they improved their monitoring systems about what teachers were doing, and they changed the way teachers were trained to something closer to coaching and accompanying teachers more than the traditional teachers training. Now, and there are many other things that they did, but going to your politics question, what the mayor told me was that the political decision that they took 15 years ago was to take politics out of the classroom, right, and out of the school. We see in many countries that principals are nominated on a political basis, right? So that's the worst thing that you could do. I mean, the principal is an extremely important actor, right, in the school, right? So first of all, you need to select people who have the characteristics to be a good principal. It's a very tough job, right? To be a manager of an extremely complex institution, right? So we can talk a lot about principles, but a key point is that you need to take politics out of the micro level decisions, right, on the educational system. So that's one point on the politics side. The other points on the politics side is more at the macro level in terms of the education policy, right? And the point I can make there is that actually, in order to make many of the reforms that are needed, many of the reforms that Sajida was explaining, for instance, teachers' career reform, for example, right? There are three things that are absolutely critical. One is the design, right? And actually, that's difficult, but at the end of the day, it's the easiest part, right? Is okay, so let's design these teachers' career reforms for Tanzania. Okay, so we have it in paper, and it's fantastic. Yes, this is what might work. Great, but that's only one thing, to have the right design. Second, you need to have the implementation capacity. Even if the design is there, right, you need to do it, right? And to do it, that's not a pedagogical challenge. It's more an implementation capacity challenge, right? You need to have people with knowledge of, suppose if we are talking about teachers' careers, you need to have people knowledgeable about human resources management, public sector administrators, and you need to have information systems, so you need to have people from all the different disciplines that are needed. So you need to have implementation capacity. And third, you need to have political alignment, right? You need to have the three things. If one of the three things are not there, then things will not change. And the implementation capacity is, as Sajida was saying, a huge issue here in Africa. But in addition to that, that is also about politics, right? Because politics is what's defined how much effort, not only how much money you put into the system. Money is important. Yes, you need money. The things will not be done, from heaven, right? You need the money. But in order to have that implementation capacity, that's also a political decision, right? Of deciding, okay, we're going to put the best in the bureaucracies of ministries of education, right? When you go to any country and you see where's the best bureaucracy, it will be in the central bank, in the Ministry of Finance, but it will never be in the social sectors. It will never be in the Ministry of Education. I've been in the Ministry of Education. I've been a bureaucrat, so I can say that, right? And that was a big challenge. So the big challenge for us was to precisely improve management capacity in the ministry and try to bring a lot of young talent and people with both with the qualifications, and something that was not easy, with the qualifications and from the different disciplines. Education, as would be health as well, and many other sectors, is about delivering a service. And the delivering of service in thousands of schools every day, right, requires a multidisciplinary team. It's not an issue of only having the right teachers and the right pedagogues. So of course you need that, but you need someone to run the system, right? And putting that people in place, it is a political decision, right? Because that will take time. So that will require a political commitment in the countries. The countries who have made it are the ones who have made that political decision.
Yeah, thank you. I have one last question about teachers to Amel. So I think we all agree that the role of teachers is critical, but many systems are stuck in a very low equilibrium. The teaching profession does not attract the best minds, though it's heartening that in Africa doesn't seem to be the biggest problem. The pre-service training is of poor quality. In-service training is typically irrelevant. Teachers don't get the on-the-job training, the mentoring. The pay is low. Teachers are not motivated. They don't show up to school. And it's really hard to break out of this cycle. Your thoughts on where to start?
Yeah. the $1 billion question. So I have the money from my fund, I think that we've been at the Education Commission. One of the initiatives is called the Workforce Initiative, and it's how to diversify the workforce. And in plain language, this means like look at health, look at doctors. Like I always say, if doctors worked like 100 years ago, how many of us will be still alive? I mean, I'm not. Like I had to take antibiotics and to go once to a hospital, And 100 years ago, you probably were more likely to die if you went to a doctor than if you didn't. So, and unfortunately today in many countries, you're more likely not to learn if you go to school, yeah. So, which is a metaphor. So education is somehow the least reformed institution of the world, probably today. And the difference is very striking. When you look at, we have this number from Chile, for example, that every doctor has around 10 people supporting them. So why is the doctor profession so exclusive? Because you have nurses, you have physiotherapists, you have, all these people. So imagine a doctor in a hospital ward, doing everything alone with like 70, let's say 70 patients. Yeah. Imagine there are no nurses, no physiotherapists, no, lab person, no one. Like one doctor, 70 patients in a hospital ward. I mean, that's what teachers are doing. And we've heard sometimes up to 100. I mean, I don't know how they do that. I mean, like, you know, we had like a few weeks ago in the UK snow, which is very rare. So the school closed for the day, which I was thinking, like, if we were in Switzerland, it would be then closed for 6 months or what. But, you know, I had my two daughters, 14 and 9, on a school-free day at home, and I was challenged. I mean, like, I mean, how would you do this every day with 100 kids? I mean, I don't know. You know, like, it's. So the question is, we have to make the teaching profession more exclusive, yeah? Which means, like, we need to have the best history, geography, math, literacy, et cetera. But to be able to do that with a 92%, you know, on budget on teacher salaries, we have to have teachers who earn less than those star content teachers, with are maybe tutors, assistant teachers, et cetera. And I think, unfortunately, Finland, again, as an example, is, I think, roughly half of the persons who are actually interacting with children in primary school, only half of them are trained teachers in the sense of teachers. So there are a lot of support people. So that we have to look at this to make the teaching profession more exclusive, to kind of diversify the workforce. And again, Brazil, an example, which, to make a bit of advertisement, I spoke about it in a TED talk about the learning crisis, which I invite you to watch. But, you know, it was, again, in the Amazonas, where I'm not going to go deeper into the example, but is the media center solution, where, you know, you had content teacher who are the star teachers, and then this is live streamed to over, like, I think 2,500 villages where tutoring teachers support the children, where they're, you know, kind of a coach is, you know, both ways. Internet breaks down, as we know. So even if the internet breaks down, there are still the tutoring teacher there, et cetera. So this, honestly, I'm like new to the education world. Like, I would say it's since 2015, maybe, yeah? For me, it's so frustrating how not bold we are, you know? So I don't know, like, what's hindering us. Maybe I'm not long enough in the education sector, and frustrates me, like, we could do, like, we are working, like, with our brains, this is the most important infrastructure at all, you know? And how can we be bolder and more innovative? So maybe it's not by chance that I have now the CEO of this project, which is kind of extremely bold. But that's, and I know that it happened. Like, I was minister in a government, and there were things that a lot of people told me it's impossible. And they are they stay impossible if we believe they are. If we believe something is possible, we can make it happen. And so I'm really encouraged this education ecosystem to be maybe less political. I was a technocrat minister, so maybe that's by chance. But and to kind of embrace more innovation, and fearless. You know, that's kind of a passion, and I hope we can make this fund work to push into innovation and entrepreneurship in the education sector.
Love the optimistic note there. I'm going to open it up. Before I do that, I want to do just one thing, which are sort of my views, and I don't think we're going to have time. I was going to ask the panel to chime in with their views, but to say something that struck me from the report was the mother tongue instruction language and what difference that makes. That was an aha for me that I hadn't really thought about. Something I wanted to see more, emphasize more, is early childhood development. I really, truly believe unless children come to school ready to learn, that's the start of the problems. And the schooling system can only do so much, but there's a lot more that needs to happen before than in the home. And the government has a role to play. And finally, I guess the teacher knowledge data that you presented, I just found totally depressing. So these were my ahas, wanted more, and totally depressed categories. And if you have time, we can come back and get yours. But let me open it up right now for questions. Okay, I'm going to start from the back there, the gentleman behind, and then on to the lady in front of him. And then I'll come forward.
Samara Solomon is my name. I'm from
Let's make it a
Associates
question, and let's make it
International.
brief, please.
Yeah. I just want to...
Closer, the mic closer, please.
Okay. Can someone from the panel tell us something about the role of the private sector in the provision of education or the expansion of education?
The role of the private sector in
the expansion.
In the
the
provision
expansion of education. Let's take the lady that's right in front.
You want to take this slide? Or?
Hello.
Let me take a couple.
In reference to capacity building in education, there was very little discussion about higher education in Africa and the role that that plays in actually providing capacity to the education sector. So I would just like to hear more about how, since donors often prioritize primary education according to the Millennial Development Goals, what role can Africa play in investing more in higher education to supply capacity?
Let's take one more in this round, and then I'll come back. I'm going my right side right now.
All right, good afternoon, Omar Silla. You guys talked about human capital, which I really appreciate, but it was no discussion about lack of energy. Like I watched a documentary on students in Guinea to study at night, have to scramble to the airport to study. So I didn't see any talk about energy, how it affects African students. Also, like some kids have to work, and because they have to go to work, they can't go to school. How does financial constraints impact their learning? And two more things. The Professor Agro spoke about food. Some students do not have food. It's kind of hard for them to study. So I was a child in Africa. I came to the United States when I was 10. And I remember when I was young, food was a problem in Africa. So I remember very vividly. When I got here, it was not an issue. So I was able to excel. Now I'm about to get my PhD. So I think food is a very good thing we should talk about. And lastly, lack of internet. So some students don't have internet. But I watched a documentary on YouTube. Like students in the Outback in Australia, they use radio to teach students in the outbacks that cannot come to school. So I think it's a lot of innovative ways we have to look at it. It's a very comprehensive approach besides teacher development. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take those, and I'm going to give them,
Yeah.
but you can also decline. The private sector, Amel, if you would take that, and perhaps the question on technology. And Professor Akbar, the higher education one, would you be willing to take that question? And Jaime, on financial constraints to accessing education.
What was the question exactly there?
That poor children cannot access education because of the costs of education.
So I got the toughest question, the role of private sector. I mean, I'm definitely not dogmatic about private versus public. I mean, I'm a product of public free education, so and quite proud of it. I think today in Africa, the private sector, I would call it the non-state actor better because it's kind of much broader, is playing a role. And I think there is a report called Business of Education in Africa. I think 21% of the children already today go to private education, some form of private education. There can be also I know that a lot of people are against it, but there can be positive. First of all, private education can happen, and then public, expenditure can go to the more marginalized and the poorer. This is one alternative. Also, private education can bring innovation that can then influence also public education. I think the key for me is not public or private. The key for me is how to regulate. So do we have strong institutions that can regulate so that not children go where 2/3 of a household income is paid for a school where the children speak 2 words of English, the parents think they're learning, but they're not. And that's kind of a really huge issue when you've spent all your money to educate your child, thinking that they're learning and they're not. So the question is how to regulate. And there are probably no one answer to it, but at least like advertising a bit for our approach is like when we say outcome payment fund, for example, because we pay only for learning outcomes, we say that also in countries with weaker institutions, this can be kind of a proxy regulator or helps at least the government to organize those PPPs, public-private partnership, in a way that can verify that learning is really happening. For me, if learning is happening and inequality is not massively increased, then the private sector has a big role to play.
Great. The role of higher education in Africa.
The role of higher education in Africa.
That cannot be overemphasized. You see, we've been talking here. We're saying that the teachers are the least paid. And we've said here that teachers, many don't want to be teachers, and it is the place where you don't have the better minds. But I disagree. Why do I disagree? Whether you're an accountant, an engineer, a doctor, a teacher taught you. But of course, when you become a teacher, you wouldn't want your own child to be a teacher. Why? Like we said, there is need for us to redefine and redesign the profession to make it more charismatic and more important. The role of higher education is very, very essential because they are the teacher trainers. Because if you have to become, in many schools, and that's what we're saying in the African Union, under the Specialized Technical Committee on Education, Science and Technology, teaching profession has to be professionalized. It is not enough for you to go to school and to have a degree in history, and you think you can impact history to primary school student or to secondary school student. No, there are tools, there are ways of teaching. It's not like entering a classroom, a lecture room in the university and just speaking and walking out. That again is another issue. Having a PhD does not mean that you can actually pass on this knowledge. And that is why the statement you made that when parents send their children to school and they can come back to be able to articulate in the English language, they think they are learning. They are not learning. And that is where the indigenous language becomes very, very essential in passing on this knowledge. And this can only be done through higher education, where you have specialized departments, like specialized departments that can train the teachers to be able to impart the right kind of knowledge through the right kind of competence and skills that the professor or the lecturer will be able to impact on the people learning. So higher education itself needs to be professionalized. For the Africa we want, for the vision we have, if higher education is not professionalized, then there is no need for us to send children to get degrees and sit back home and not being able to get a job. And that is why the Continental TVET scheme is based on the higher education, for us to be able to look at the challenges, profess solutions to those challenges, and impact those solutions to the student or to the population for them to be able to be functional to the society. And that can only be done if the government is aware of what is going on, or if they even know the role they play. And that is where research and development becomes very important. And this research can only be taken by the postgraduate students who can go back to their societies and look at the needs that they need to do. So that is where the role of higher education becomes very, very essential, because they are the teachers, trainers, who will in turn train the kids that we put in their charge.
I want to take a couple of questions from that side, but Jaime,
Okay.
just quickly.
So very quickly, two things. One is on the issue of cost of sending children to school. I think the key role, I mean, that the idea, I think, of free quality basic education for all. I think now that's very clear for everyone, right? And at some point there was the discussion if a fee-based model would make sense. Now countries who had that model are moving to a fee-free model, education model, which I think makes all the sense in the world. Conditional cash transfers on the other side will actually try to, promote kids to go to school. School feeding programs, they will be very useful, but in many cases there is an implementation capacity issue in order to make progress on that, or also there's another financial constraint there. But I think at least, making sure that the country's investment in order to for every kid to have free basic education, I think that's critical. And on the role of I want to quickly go to the role of the private sector.
Sure.
Which is, I agree with the point that one doesn't have to be dogmatic in terms of, yes, it should be all public necessarily, or the role of the private sector should be big or small. The key point is that what the government and societies have to always worry and always think that it's their responsibility is to make sure that everyone gets a free, high quality education, that has the opportunity, right, of having a free, high quality education, right? That no one is precluded to have that because they don't have resources. If that happens, then you're fine, right? Now, you can have private schools in a system like that. Yes, you can have private schools, but that would mean at least two things. One is that what you were saying. There has to be a regulatory capacity because. And actually, sometimes there's that ideological view that the private school will be better, right? Necessarily better than the private school, the public school, right? And that's not true. There's a huge variance of private schools. True, in many countries you will have probably that the best schools might be private, but maybe the worst schools are also private, right? In many cases you will find scams, right, that are related to the private sector, right? And at the same time you have fantastic schools as well. right? However, then the key point for governments is that they cannot say that it's not their responsibility to make sure that the quality of any private offer, right, is good. That's my first point. And the second point is that what you cannot have is a two-tier system. It wouldn't be healthy for a country to say, okay, so those who can pay, okay, fine, have your high quality education. And for those who cannot pay, there's the public sector. Okay, that you cannot have. You cannot have a two-tiered system, and it would just say, okay, so you're a second-class citizens, have that for you. We'll keep that for you. So that is one reason why some societies have decided, if you go to the Nordic societies, right? I don't know if it's by chance, but it was a social choice to say, no, we want everyone to have a high-quality public education. So what's the public enrollment in Finland? 99 point something percent, right? Okay, so maybe many countries will not be able to have that, right? But we'll need to make sure is that never avoid the responsibility, right, of assuring that everyone has a high quality education independently on their income or their background or their gender, etc.
Yeah. And those countries show us that there isn't a trade-off between having an equitable system and a high-quality system. You can do both.
You can do both.
I don't want to be accused of favoring my right only, so I'm going over time, but I want to take 2 questions from the left. Maybe there's only one. All right, gone.
There's one there and the gentleman there.
Yeah, okay, we'll take those 2. Go ahead, sir, go ahead.
Don't fight.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Joseph Ngu. I work for MCC.
A little closer.
I work for MCC, the Millennium Challenge Corporation in education. Yes. I first a little comment, and then maybe my questions will follow. First of all,
We're over time, so please quick.
Yes, very, very, very quick. It is good. I've heard all what the panelists have said, but more importantly, I think we always make promises to improve the welfare of teachers or give them a living salary. You can see even in America here, you have a problem. Teachers here suffer, but they're in a better position because there are other supporting instruments here to support. They have families that may be richer and so on. But in Africa, it's not the same. Teachers are still paid like we are still in the 11th century.
Okay, a question, please.
Yeah. The question, what can you do that can change that situation? The second question is, the presenter spoke mostly about about pupils, and we thought about formal education. The population is rising. In a very short while, it will be double. So what are they going to do with those that don't have formal education? They'll be in the non-formal sector. So, and then the third question is languages. Okay. They should not be learning their languages because non-formal educated people will be looking for ways to get here, and they'll be coming very fast. So be prepared if you don't train them to stay.
No 3-part question, please, just one.
That's fine, I just have one question. I think in today's world in Africa, especially like in South Africa, we see issues of violence around there, and I just want to know if there's any data accessible that links exposure to this violence among young African children and their educational opportunities.
Okay, so what I'd like to do is, since we did talk a lot about teachers, if someone is willing to take the question on non-formal education, does it make sense to have systems that recognize the learning children have outside school and build bridges between non-formal education and formal education? And on the violence, do you have data on that, Sajita? So I'll ask Sajita to respond to that. Anybody willing to take the non-formal, formal interaction?
No, I think it would make sense. I mean, I wouldn't preclude any innovative idea of that sort. Again, the key issue is regulation and making sure that the experience that the person will have in that case will be an experience that will be not exactly the same, but analogous and with the same and the same formative value that experience that someone in a regular school will have.
Yeah, there are countries that are trying certification systems for knowledge that students have acquired outside the school system. Sajita, on the violence question, do you just want to come up to the microphone?
We actually record data from the SACMEC surveys that do have a question on violence in schools. And we incorporate it in an analysis of minimum learning conditions in schools. Actually, it is shocking, the level of violence that students experience. I think it was something like 60%, 70% of kids. Don't quote me exactly, but I can't remember the data. But it is an astonishing proportion of kids that have faced some kind of violence. These are just the southern and eastern African countries. So it's not systematically collected. It's known to be prevalent in East Africa through other surveys also, and you can get that data, but we used only the school-based survey. The interesting thing is countries like Kenya have introduced something in their teacher professional development, ethics, as well as their professional development assessments that monitor violence. So now there is some mechanism by which that is being addressed. So it's an issue that you're right that it's important. And maybe, Tamar, just to say that many of the other questions that have been raised, they are actually in the book. I didn't get a chance to respond to them, but we have covered many of them, like private schools. And
I apologize for going over. Thank you for the authors of the report. They've done a fantastic job. Thank you very much for my panel for going into depth, and thanks to all of you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.